Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome journalists Jacqueline Alemany, Robert Costa, Heidi Przybyla, and moderator John Harwood.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's great to moderate a panel with three of the outstanding young journalists covering politics. And when I say young, I don't mean to slight their experience, but they're all young to me. I also can't fail to observe the big picture here and place sort of in context the problems we're about to talk about. The last time Jackie and I were together, we were traveling in Israel and the West Bank with an organization called Peace Players, which tried to bring Israelis and Palestinians together through basketball. And seeing the ghastly events that are unfolding in that part of the world right now makes me be thankful that our problems are on the scale that they are. Nevertheless, we do have problems. And one of them is how journalism treats this moment of peril for democracy. And so let me kick it off this way. The role of journalism in our democracy is embedded in the Constitution. And throughout all of our careers, we have had embedded in the ethic of our line of work something that was not always true in the history of the country, which is that we have a press that strives to be nonpartisan, that does not choose between political parties, and that tries to fairly present the choices that voters face so they can make their decisions. But January 6th was a bit of a pivot point that dramatized and made clear to me, and I'll ask my colleagues, that we do have a serious threat to the functioning of our democracy. And so I wanted to ask each of you just to state briefly your view of these questions, and then we'll get into some of the how and why. Do you believe that democracy is under threat at the moment? And if it is it part of the responsibility of the press to be partisans for democracy? Heidi, let me start with you.
I believe it is because the polling tells us that it is. And I know we'll get into the role of the media later and what these troubling poll numbers say for the media, but what you're seeing is not only a decline in faith in journalism and in the role of the media and free press, but in democracy itself, and those are running parallel. And I would go back even further, John. I know you want to be brief on this, but I want to share an anecdote from 2016 from a journalist who's in the generation, I would say, above me, Lynn Sweet. We were in a CNN studios, opposite studios, and I came out. I didn't really know her. She didn't really know me. But we were both feeling that something was changing very profoundly about our industry and how we were perceived by the public. And she said to me, "Hey, you, come here." And she pulled out a New York Times and started marking it up. And she said, "Listen to me. I'm on my way, into my sunset in this career, but we're in a dire moment right now. And this is on you and your generation of journalists." And she said, "I want you to speak very plainly to the American public. I'll give you an example. Social Security, entitlements. Don't use words like that. Don't use words like discretionary and mandatory spending in the budget. Say, before we had Social Security, if you were an old person who didn't have family to take care of you, you would probably just die and there would be no safety net for you." In any event, my point, John, is that I don't think this started on January 6th. I don't think it started in 2016. I think we've had a very long runway to get here, and it's partly structural, largely structural, and we can get into that.
Bob?
Of course, John, I believe democracy is under threat, and I believe we should be full-throated in our support of democracy at all times. But I also believe the press does too much of talking to itself about this. It's not our job to just state these things. We have to convince people about the values of these principles through the work we do, to do more reporting, more listening, more engagement with people. So we're not just blandly stating we support democracy, but we can back it up with our actions. And I think the vigor of the press has become a real troubling aspect of American democracy and the lack thereof across the country. I used to travel to state capitals when I started as a journalist 17 years ago, full time, and there'd be 50 to 60 people in most of these state capitals, and now you go there to many of these same places, and there are between 5 and 10 people covering state government. I'm sure in your own local municipalities, there may be 1 or 2 or 0 people covering what's going on in a local community or a state government. And so democracy is clearly under threat because those in power are not getting the same scrutiny they deserve. And there's also a lack of shared understanding of the country's history. Civics is something that's almost non-existent in many schools in this country. And so it's fine for us to state it. We should be proud to state our support for democracy. We should be unflinching in how we describe what democratic values are, and those who go against it speak up about it, tell the truth about those who are trying to erode democracy. But I really worry that if we just stay talking to ourselves and feeling good that we're saying we support democracy and we fight for democracy, well, democracy won't continue to exist in this country because there'll be an establishment group in the press and in the political class that feels very self-satisfied, and the rest of the country unmoored from democratic principles because they're not being taught and they're not in the press. They'll just continue to float away, and that self-satisfaction we might find from stating this will just be something that's pretty useless.
Jackie?
Yeah, I mostly agree with everything that was just said. I want to take it a step more contrarian than what Bob said, which is, yes, obviously we are partisan for democracy, but that is not to say that we don't question our imperfect democracy. There is a reason for why distrust in government is so low. The way that we have seen democracy utilized and exploited, I guess, in recent years has resulted in a minoritarian rule, really. We're seeing that right now in the Senate and in a lot of different institutions where 1 or 2 people, Tommy Tuberville or Matt Gaetz, can completely hold up the entire process to a point where things are fairly broken in Washington. Even going back, I've been thinking about this for a few days now. If I were an embed covering Alexander Hamilton, I could imagine myself pressing, why did you make the Electoral College? What exactly woke mob were you worried about so much of overthrowing the government that you felt like you needed to put in a buffer between the institutions in the US and the people and the popular vote? And even going back now, I think, a little moving up to the civil rights movement, that was something that was completely missed by mainstream white media. It took years of repetition and advocacy to some extent for Black press, small Black local outlets to raise issues with, again, our imperfect democracy for it even to rise to mainstream media coverage. So I think there's a fine line between, towing our institutional line and being sort of blind to these founding principles, and that our North Star really at the end of the day should always be, trust but verify, question everything. I think, we all to a certain extent missed January 6th because of, I think, our focus on the institutions rather than understanding this anti-institutional movement that propelled a lot of what we're seeing right now in mainstream politics.
You raise an issue that I think is important, which is to try to define what the problem is exactly. There's one way of looking at the threat to democracy and say it's about the losers accepting legitimate defeats in their election and the peaceful transfer of power and all the things that go into that, counting ballots accurately, letting the electorate participate, and then living with the results. But in this moment, I think many people are looking at long-standing features of our system and regarding them differently because of the questioning of election results. So you mentioned the counter-majoritarian elements of our system, the Electoral College, the composition of the Senate, the rules of the Senate. Should we, Heidi, cover those things as, if not equivalent to the controversies about election results, but as part of this larger threat to majority rule in the United States?
Unequivocally, yes. And this is getting into part of the broader landscape of what's wrong with the media today. Part of it is, I think the founders envisioned us as representing you, the people, asking questions to power on behalf of the people. But over time, a lot of the media coverage has come to be about covering the political parties themselves, access to the political parties, and scoops. This just in, hot take, newsy scoops that position you ahead of your competitors and get you that kind of esteemed position within, again, like Bob says, your industry and your peers. Whereas we're having a crisis, we've all agreed, listening to these previous panels, of fundamental understanding of civics in this country, and people who don't understand and have never heard basic facts, for instance, about how skewed the representation has come to be in the Senate, which the founders envisioned as a cooling saucer, but now is very misrepresentative of the broader population per capita. These are things that we should not take a position on, but these are things that we certainly need to illuminate the public, as people are not understanding why, when you look at both Republicans and Democrats, why Washington isn't representing people like me. That's how the question is asked a lot of times, right? So there's the hot take problem and the competition to get scoops, but I also think, John, that the structural problems may be even more consequential, and that is, probably many people in this audience came up in an era of news where you had these storied evening news anchor gatekeepers who everyone trusted when it came to accuracy, and we were all kind of listening to the same information, even though that period was a period of great tumult, right, in the 1960s, early 1970s, but there was still a lot of faith in media. That's kind of where you saw the trend line start to trend down. And I think that what that's been replaced with, there's some really good aspects to that, right? We have now digital media, linear television, much more voices, like Jackie said. When you have diversity in your voices and in your messengers, that's good for democracy. Unfortunately, I think what's replaced it also is a bit of a circus tent, where you have journalists, pseudo-journalists, and even anti-journalists, people who are openly anti-journalist under the same tent that is called the media. You have individuals who have opinion programs running alongside journalists asked to go on opinion programs. You have a public that was used to hearing news during the day and then opinion at night, but then that kind of bled in together. And so,
who in particular do you think is anti-journal? I agree with you, some people are, but how would you identify the group of people who are journalists?
A lot of the Fox evening news hosts come for us all personally, right? They feature us in their news programs.
So that's from the right?
Yes. I mean, we're seeing now in the polling, I think, less trust among, and we can talk about this too, among younger Democrats as well, but this is overwhelmingly coming from the right. And so that, I think, is now given way to a system where you are what you eat and you can choose your media diet. And so we're all in these little silos consuming only that which tastes and feels good to us, and not which gives us all of the proper context. So I think your first question was, your question here was about whether we need to cover these broader kind of systemic problems or debates that we need to be having in society. And my answer to that is we need to put a heat shield around investigative journalists who can take the time to provide the public with that kind of context, and then just pray that they listen to us, because so much has happened now with the estimation of the media.
Bob, let me ask you a question about how we do this. If everyone on this panel has agreed we should be partisan for democracy, the question is, how do you do that? What language do you use? I'll give you an example. While Donald Trump was president, we all know Donald Trump lied all the time. That's pretty much all he does. We got pressure in the media to use that word. And some people resisted using that word. You have to consider, if you're very blunt in your language, do you alienate part of your audience, or do you state it in a different way? In the aftermath of the election, much of the media got comfortable using that word, saying these are lies about the election. How broadly should we take that approach to things that we know are not true? I'll just give you a very small example from the legislation that the new speaker laid out this week about aid to Israel. He said only in what they proposed to pay for the aid to Israel by cutting IRS tax enforcement, which in fact would not pay for anything. It would cost the government money because that money is used to collect taxes from people who don't pay what they ought to pay. We know that. That's not controversial. How do you see that question? What terms should we use, and how diplomatic should we be in covering those stories?
Well, respectfully, I think words really matter, because journalists are now under intense pressure, and we are competing with people. Journalism is not like the law. There's no entryway for journalism. Anyone can be a journalist. If you have a phone or you have an X account or something else, you can become a journalist because you're sharing information. Use the term partisan for democracy. I wouldn't use the term partisan. I would say I'm an advocate for democracy, a defender of democracy, but to me the word partisan has a political partisan, like the democracy is a party. I would say I'm a force.
Okay, that's fine, advocate.
No, but see, but I'm just trying to make the point.
Yeah.
Words matter. I would never use the word partisan because people saying would interpret it, and I'm sensitive to this all the time because my job is to engage constantly with voters. And if they hear I'm a, quote, partisan for anything, why would they think about me as a journalist who can come at something with vigor, but also an opportunity to listen if they hear the word partisan? So I wouldn't use that word. I would use the word lie. If a Republican lies or a Democrat lies, call it a lie. And when it comes to something like the aid to Israel, words matter. Respectfully. For example, and John probably wouldn't have done this if he was on TV talking about this, but if I was on TV talking about the aid to Israel proposed by Speaker Johnson, I don't just make a blanket statement that it's going to add to the deficit. Because what are you going to do if you're a Republican here? You're going to go, where does that come from? I would say I would attribute it directly to the Congressional Budget Office evaluation of the legislation, which says that this proposal by Johnson, the new speaker, to tie aid to Israel to cuts to the IRS budget, it could balloon the deficit according to the CBO analysis. So you're attributing something to a credible source in the CBO so people know the information I'm saying about how this adds to the deficit, advocated by a conservative speaker, is not my opinion. It's not something I'm just coming up with, but it's based on my reporting and my analysis of the CBO study of the bill. And we're wading through waters now where if we're not constantly thinking about how language is loaded for many people, then we're not going to break through with the very people we need to connect with. Pew Research shows in its latest study about media consumption that this whole country is watching far less news than it was just 5 or 7 years ago. Dramatic slip in the news. Well, where are they going? To Heidi's point, they're not just always going to nowhere or just to social media. There are new alternative media sources, and it's on us to recognize we're in a fiercely competitive environment for people's attention, and our credibility is intertwined with the language we use.
But doesn't that, if you in fact are editing your language because you're concerned about how it will be...
No, I didn't say that. Not about concern. It's about being accurate to a point where people can really hear it.
My question is, doesn't that put you in the position of being yourself a politician? That is to say, you're mindful of the effect that your words are going to have, even if they're not the words that you would use if you were talking to a friend or a family member. In other words...
Well, I don't think you should use casual language when you're professionally reporting, but I also think When I call something a lie, that's not being a politician. People don't like the word lie, but if something's a lie, you have to call it a lie.
Well, in that case,
and partisan, my point on partisan, we can have a respectful disagreement. I think that's a term, and I understand. You and I believe, have the same position on democracy. It's under threat, needs to be defended. We need to be forceful advocates for it. But you're right. I wouldn't say I'm a politician, but I am careful because I represent CBS News and I want to have the broadest possible audience. So yes, I think I don't use always the language I might use with my brother or sister in private over dinner.
but just to pursue it for a second, why would you then use the word lie about the election results as opposed to saying 70 courts ruled this or that and there's no evidence of this or that? Why would you get to the point where you say, okay, I am going to use the word for that?
Well, I'll give you an example from the real world. Tomorrow on CBS Sunday Morning, I have a piece on democracy and about election 2024, if you want to watch tomorrow morning on CBS. And I spoke to James Fallows from The Atlantic.
Very effective.
And in the course of the scripting, we have a standards and ethics process at CBS News. And it's about how to frame what did Trump do in the post-2020 period. How do you frame that in script so it comes across as accurate and as forceful as possible without entering into territory where it could be pulled apart by someone who wants to question CBS News? So if you're going to say, what did Trump do? He did try to overturn the 2020 election results. It was obvious in all of his public statements he was trying to do that. He
says he was trying to get an accurate count and that he actually won the election.
But he was trying to overturn the result. That was a factual thing that happened. He was also trying to block the certification of the 2020 election. Blocking the certification, I believe, as a reporter, is a fair phrase to use. Where you get into tough territory as a journalist, and you might disagree with this, John, if CBS wants to say Trump tried to, quote, subvert the 2020 election and use the word subvert, Trump's now facing 5 ongoing trials, 2 of them related to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. If you're going to use a word like subvert, because he's facing ongoing litigation on this, you often have to put the word allegedly subvert, because subvert implies in some of the word, in the definition, intent. And he's being now prosecuted for possible criminal intent. What's not under question, if you put aside the idea of subversion, which you may say is accurate and I may say is accurate, but he's facing criminal charges that are ongoing. But to say he's blocking the certification, that's true without question. And the fact that he tried to overturn is true without question, because those were actions. So, if you describe actions he took versus anything that implies intent, you're in a clear editorial zone. Now, this is an area of debate. There's no right or wrong answer, but these are the kind of choices I'm actively having to make as a journalist, and how we frame things with language to be as tough as possible, to get as close as possible to the truth without being in a position where you're vulnerable to say you're implying intent if you can't actually prove it.
I'm going to go to Heidi in a second, but just want to make a point, reinforce a point that Robert just said, which is that nobody makes rules for journalists that tell journalists what to do. All of us approach our job in the way that we see fit, and people are going to make different judgments about different aspects of this. And one question I have is, if you say that, I'm going to do X and not Y because I think people are going to question me if I do X. How do you square that with the fact that people are going to question you whether you do X, Y, Z, or Q? So I'm going to put that on the table. Go ahead, Heidi.
I think we need to do both, right? We need to be extremely vigilant about accuracy in the language that we use, but we also need to be more forceful about the language that we use. Because we're not dealing with two parties and the old paradigm of here's what one party says and here's what the other party says. We're dealing with a faction of a party that is discarding the norms of democracy. And I don't think it's good enough for us to just state that. We have to contextualize it for people and tell them why that is a fair label to use. Again, getting back to the issue of civics. This is now part of our role, is to explain civics to the public. And contextualizing that means okay, in the past we'd use words like staunch or hardliner, right? And now, and I wrote this down anticipating this question, here's how I would contextualize using authoritarian. And this has not just to do with January 6th, this has to do with the entire experience of the previous administration, which is inciting political violence, consolidating power, demanding loyalty, demonizing the media, immigrants, scientists, judges, and then the issue of self-enrichment. We do see these as hallmarks across the globe of authoritarian rule. In fact, there's a through line between what was happening with authoritarian leaders in Brazil and the Philippines, as well as in terms of tactics, like using Facebook. I don't know if y'all are aware of that, but Facebook was a major means of spreading misinformation by leaders in other countries as well. So I'm going to say accuracy it's never been more important. But to your point, to your question previously about contextualization is so important right now because each one of these things individually might not stand out to the public, but it needs to be all woven together for them to understand. I remember Madeleine Albright being on set, coming up after her, and her using a quote from her book about fascism, a warning, which is that if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody will notice.
Jackie, let me go back to a point that related to our earlier discussion and what you raised about the counter-majoritarian elements of our system. We see that Donald Trump is leading a movement that itself, through the post-election results in 2020, January 6th, and since, has attempted to overturn the results of the election, okay? You've seen a series of other elements that also are in different ways from different parts of the same party, trying to negate majority rule. Things like states have votes on expanding Medicaid, and then the legislature nullifies the actions that voters took. Or voters in Florida voting to return voting rights to ex-felons, people who fulfilled their sentences, and then the legislature passing a law to require them to pay money before they could do that. We've seen the new speaker, some members of the Senate on the Republican side say that democracy is not a good thing because, as Mike Johnson said, democracy is two lambs and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. And so the whole notion is that majority rule imperils inherently the rights and existence of the minority. How do we cover the fact that this threat, while it theoretically could exist on both sides of the spectrum, is in practice coming from one side of the spectrum? I talked to Richard Haass not long ago, the former Republican foreign policy advisor, head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and asked him to sort of summarize the stakes in 2024. And he said, if we're going to preserve democracy in the United States, Biden must win the election. That has to happen. And when I interviewed Biden, I said, are you comfortable making that argument? Because it sounds kind of crazy to say, we're in a democracy, voters have a choice, but only one of those choices is going to preserve the democracy. How do we handle that?
Well, it's certainly confusing, right? Because we all were taught in history growing up that minority rule and minority powers were necessary to some extent so that, you know, our government wasn't very quickly putting into place these radical changes that you know, the minority that might not be good for the country and that would throw us into tumult, especially if, you know, president was only in power for 4 years and we would go through these really dramatic swings. But some of the things that the framers obviously did not anticipate, two things mainly, were the rapid and diverse population growth that we've seen in the U.S. And the deeply entrenched and polarized two-party rule. And so what has happened, I think what we've really seen is one party trying to stem or curb some of what we've seen with this population growth through minority rule. And it has essentially brought the government to a standstill at some points, and in some respects. And it's now used to undercut these long-standing principles that our society has operated by. So, even this is just fresh in my mind right now. The motion to vacate this arbitrary rule that was passed by the House GOP conference, the majority party in the House of Representatives, where it only takes one member to oust the Speaker of the House. It's crazy. It's not and it's, that is something that I think the majority of Republicans would agree on, but the way that they passed the rule, they're not going to be able to get rid of this rule right now in order to at least stay open and avoid the situation that we were just in for the past month. So I think covering it, it does require some grounding in history and making sure that we can contextualize it. And it also, I think, requires understanding the ways that democracy has and the Constitution, where it has its weak spots, and where our government and institutions can grow and maybe improve. Even with our January 6th coverage, it ultimately led us to, and it led Congress to this debate over making a tweak to the electoral certification process so that we wouldn't have another situation where Vice President Pence would, be fearing for his life because he was going to make the final decision to certify the election, and making sure that there was some sort of law or rule put into place where the vice president does have the final say in who ultimately wins an election. That, of course, was, as everything has been recently in our Congress, very controversial and a contentious debate, and that is largely because of the, again, the growth of the minoritarian in our government.
Bob, but how would you answer that question of, Richard says to preserve democracy, Joe Biden has to win. If you think he's correct in that, how do we cover that? How do we say that, or should we say that?
I think Jackie just mentioned we need to have an understanding of history, and John is nudging toward the point that we really have to grapple with what the Republican Party has become. And I was just paging through a few days ago David Remnick's book, Lenin's Tomb, which is such an eyewitness account of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It really made me think about what we're covering now with the Republican Party. It's not the Soviet Union, but we're watching a transformational, historic shift inside of the Republican Party. And I think there's no easy fix here, John, in terms of addressing what this means for democracy, how we frame this all up. But we have to really process that we are in a convulsive, historic moment. I began my career covering the Tea Party movement in 2009. The Republican Party brought it in. In 2011, I started to get to know Donald Trump. Why? He was a birther. He was questioning whether President Obama was born in this country, a racist campaign against an incumbent president about his own birth certificate. What happened a year later in 2012? Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee, embraced Trump in Las Vegas, accepting his endorsement. And then after they lose in 2012, they decide to have this autopsy to change the party's position on immigration. What happens in 2013? The base pushes back on the huge immigration push, the bipartisan immigration bill. And then in 2014, I start to get to know Donald Trump again as he's coming to run for president in 2015. Everyone ignores it. Ultimately, they accept him, they embrace him. He wins the presidency in 2016. He shatters almost every norm in Republican politics. He makes the Republican Party a party now that on trade issues, on economic issues, is essentially where the Democratic Party was in the mid-1980s. And it's a total upheaval. And so democracy is something that's sustained by some sort of norm of democratic governance and the rule of law. And I remember sitting with Trump on mid-October 2016, flying from Canton, Ohio to LaGuardia Airport. And I said, "Are you going to accept this election?" He said, "Well, I'll never lose. I'll never lose." I said, "Well, you might lose." And he said he just would not accept the idea that he could ever lose an election. And I thought at the time that it was odd, and we wrote about it in the Washington Post. But just to your point, John, yes, many people believe President Biden is the best person for American democracy to survive. And that often comes from Democrats, not from Republicans. But inside the Democratic Party, there's a huge question of whether now President Biden can beat President Trump. Should former President Trump be the nominee? I was just interviewing Dean Phillips, this congressman from Minnesota, who's running against President Biden for the Democratic nomination. You have the No Labels group hovering out there, Cornel West running as an independent, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running as an independent. And so it's not as easy for the press to just come out and say Biden equals democracy when Democrats inside the party, independent-leaning left people, are having their own questions about Biden's electability.
Well, I'm speaking on the assumption that that's a general election choice. Obviously, there's the Democratic Party.
But it's already not going to be a general election choice because you have two independent candidates in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West.
Well, right. Sure. Yeah. That is the general election.
Right. I mean, and there's an editorial role to make endorsements. I mean, we have the Washington Post editorial page. You have columnists. I don't think news organizations need to take a political stand on an election, but you can lay out the stakes for American democracy in vivid detail and say, if Trump's the nominee, this Republican nominee has been participating in schemes that have been called criminal across the board to overturn the last election, has still not accepted defeat in the last election, and was part of what many people have testified under oath was a criminal conspiracy to undermine and defraud the United States. That's fact. And I think you can say that without saying Biden is best.
Well,
let me go back to one word choice you used. You described Trump's campaign or initial emergence as racist.
Yes.
You talk to Donald Trump, he says, "I'm the least racist person in the world." Why are you comfortable using that word to describe something that is not susceptible to factual proof?
That's true. Racist can imply intent, but he was questioning the first black president's love of country, patriotism, and origin of birth. And at the Washington Post, we used the term racist to describe the birther credential when I was there, and I am comfortable using it now because
I agree with you, but my only point is there are analytical judgment calls that you make that make words acceptable, and one of the questions that we have is when do you use that discretion?
It's because, right, and at times if you can't understand intent, you can use racially charged as a phrase that's often used in journalism.
Yes.
Racially charged campaign, a racially charged, but if there's literally no proof of something and it's racially charged, if you're making a false statement, a lie about someone, and it has an origin to do with their race at some extent, or their origin, or their ethnic origin, it's fair to use the term racist. I mean, again, these phrases aren't comfortable. The word lie is not comfortable. We don't love to throw it around, the word racist. But you have to call something what it is. And I agree, it's always a conversation in newsrooms about where exactly to go and how to do it, and it's an imperfect process.
Heidi, we in both print and television are facing declining audiences, difficulty for news judgment, news organizations across the board, shrinking local news footprints. In your view, does it matter if we call something racist or racially charged, or if we say something is a lie or something that lacks evidence? Does that make a difference? Is it going to persuade or not persuade?
I don't know that it's going to persuade or not persuade. I do know that I take you back to my original kind of position on all of this, which is that what Bob just did was contextualize his use of that word. I don't think we can use words like that if we're not contextualizing it and giving examples of why we're using that language. But to your broader question about how should we cover this as a choice between democracy and Trump, I think we need to fundamentally change the way we've covered elections around the horse race paradigm, which is here's what the polls are, here's where the polls are, reader or viewer, and Trump's up today, and he's really consolidating the base, and here's the demographic numbers of like who he has and who he doesn't. That's important, but it's not everything. And I think this culture is kind of built up of really just focusing on this just-in data, whereas this moment, that fails us in this moment. And what we need to do is, if we're going to use the language like I just described as authoritarian playbook, for instance, we need to contextualize the fact that whereas in 2016, Trump was making comments like lock her up, and everybody said hardy har har, in this election, there's an actual platform that you can call authoritarian. It's called Project 2025, which really envisions the unitary executive theory where you have a lot of consolidation of power underneath the president, and that includes defunding the Justice Department, the FBI, quasi-independent agencies like the FCC, which oversees television and digital, which was a known thorn in the side of President Trump, as well as just basically throwing out the bums of civil servants and bringing in
The swamp.
The
deep state.
Swamp, and throwing them out and bringing in people who are bona fide loyalists to the president. Now, I think that's a hell of a lot more important to cover than the latest poll. We have a lot that we're contending with to get over that hump, and probably a lot of people would be, shooting darts and arrows at me right now. I'm far enough along in my career, I don't care. I think it's really important in this moment to change our language and our approach to coverage, but we have a lot that we're up against in our business models where we're all, especially with the linear television, speaking to specific audiences that want to hear specific things and tune in to hear the things that feel good to them. And so I'm not optimistic that everyone's going to do that, but that's my opinion.
Let me just say, I agree with your characterization of those plans to overhaul the federal government. I have personally no hesitation at calling that authoritarian. But I would just say, to the point that Bob was making about, when do you use evidence or when do you apply your analytical judgment to use a word? If you ask the people who are hatching and advancing those plans, they will say that they are replacing members of the deep state who are attempting to subvert the will of the people who have elected a given government. Now, I happen to think that's complete BS, and I don't mind saying that, but people do have to make judgments about how they describe it. And you made a point that is resonant with me, which is that the further along you are in your career, the more that you have seen, the more free you feel to describe things as you see them, as compared to, let's say, how I would have felt at a much earlier point in my career when I had many more decades to go.
Mm-hmm. I think we need to establish that, and not just me using the language, but this is where you bring in your experts. And this is why we're at such a perilous moment, is because so many of those experts have been delegitimized. Like if you go back to COVID, the doctors were attacked. So who am I supposed to call now if I can't call a doctor to tell you, hey, you better wear a mask, this thing is dangerous. But to your point, mm-hmm. I would call historians. I have a piece running in the next couple of weeks based on misrepresentation, I won't go too far, but misrepresentation of medieval era common law that relates to the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs. Leave it at that. I brought in the historians, and if that's what we need to do, then that's not a hard thing to do to establish our use of that language.
Jackie, let me go to the issue of platforming. One of the controversies in journalism is do you provide a platform, a megaphone, for people who are going to say things that you believe or know to be untrue? This is relevant to the coverage of Trump. It seems to me you must cover the Republican nominee for president if, in fact, he becomes the Republican nominee, which also know he's going to say a lot of things that are not true. How do we deal with that? And should there be rules on what gets platformed? I don't mean across journalism rules. I mean in your own mind. How do you think about the issue of what should be platformed and what should not?
I'm going to answer that question, I promise. I've just been like squirreling up some thoughts here.
Good.
And I want to add a little dose of optimism, which is that the system is currently working, just so everyone knows. I mean, Donald Trump is facing 91 criminal charges and is on trial in three, four different civil, criminal, five cases. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom here. And, you know, a lot of, I mean, I think that we all need to sort of like adjust the way that we do really cover democracies, back to your initial point, because of the post-Soviet era way that we are seeing authoritarians now gain power. It used to be done militarily, and now really since the Cold War, you're seeing authoritarians do it through democratic elections and then sort of shooting the gaps in their democracies to slowly amass and accumulate power. First, you know, making the police force a personal military, then, you know, hacking, confiscating voting machines. So, you know, we are keeping tabs on how all of those things are adding up. But in that vein, I don't think that, you know, not every Democrat would say Joe Biden equals, you know, democracy. Right now, we're hearing an uproar of Democrats who believe that Joe Biden has essentially given Netanyahu the green light for genocide in Gaza, as Israeli forces are continuing their ground offensive and invasion. So I do think this is where it's really about just sticking to, I know I sound so conservative and antiquated, but just sticking to the facts and holding power to account, questioning every decision that's made and getting as many voices as possible, as many accurate, factual, you know, fact-based voices. Which leads us to the platform question, which is, it's as Heidi and Bob have both stressed, it's all about context. Gone are the days where you can just slap up a headline that says so-and-so said this. It now needs to be, you know, Trump espouses unsubstantiated lie of you know, election fraud for 1500th time at campaign rally. Like that is the bare minimum. The media has certainly evolved and grown since the 2016 campaign, when I think we were a much more horse race focused national press apparatus. But I think that like platforms also is a problem. I think, you know, giving voice to platforms that necessarily shouldn't have a huge amplification is an issue with the press, a larger issue with the press. It's the death of local news. It's the death of literacy rates and news literacy rates in schools around the country, in addition to low, you know, civic rates, is atrocious. And that's largely because of the death of local news. And I think if we had less reporters all covering the speaker's race, you know, there's no need for 100 different reporters from however many different outlets to be covering the same incremental, minute-by-minute thing that's happening on Capitol Hill. I think what's much more important is putting people out there to tell, you know, different stories, harder to scrape up stories, and digging up new things about people who don't want whatever you're digging to be publicly revealed. That is far more important. And so I think we can, in part, solve this issue of the loudest voices, which has created this whole perverse, system that incentivizes the voices, political voices, to really say the most outrageous and inaccurate things as possible, because they know it's going to get them media coverage, clicks, and dollars. It's this kind of horrible cycle. If we had more journalists around the country and in different places covering different stories, I think we could alleviate that issue.
Bob, let me, I'm glad that Jackie raised the optimism point, and let me ask you about that. If you're somebody who believes that, Donald Trump's conduct in office and the things that he says are harmful to democracy, you have seen in 2018, 2020, 2022, voters react to that. We have seen, as Jackie indicated, the legal system pursuing accountability for Donald Trump without civil unrest. We saw local elections, midterm elections in 2022, without violence, with all but in one or two cases, the losers conceding the election, not trying to fight and overturn the results. Have we in the media exaggerated the scale of the threat to democracy? Is it more resilient than we have portrayed it?
It's resilient. I think the media needs to do, to answer your question about platforming as well, what is platforming? To me, platforming is when in 2016, the cable networks put Donald Trump's rally on for hours, oftentimes just showing an empty lectern and microphone, waiting for him to come, and then giving him an hour on television to talk without context, without critiquing, without reporting. That's providing someone with a platform without the necessary repertorial construct around it that would give it context. My argument in 2016 as a reporter remains my argument for 2024, which is Trump is actually undercovered. There needs to be more accountability journalism on Trump. I know people are exhausted by Trump, including news organizations, but who here can tell me what's Donald Trump's new immigration proposal for 2025 that he came out with this week? Can anyone here tell me? See, that's the problem we have. Donald Trump came out this week and said he is going to push for mass deportations on day one. Mass deportations, sweeping across the country. And he's echoing exactly what Steve Bannon has been saying for months. Now Trump's adopted it as his position. So you have an enormously disruptive immigration policy being proposed by the Republican frontrunner, but it clearly doesn't land with this educated group, and that's not with any disrespect for any of you, because it's not being covered in a serious way, because Trump's not seen, in a sense, as a serious person, even though he's a very serious political figure, and he could well be the next president of the United States. And we're all still trying to process in this country, what does it mean for an incumbent president to lose, not accept the election, and then run for president again? Can you imagine in 1984 or 1983, 3 years after 1980, Jimmy Carter hasn't accepted defeat and is running around the country and saying he's going to run again in 84 for vengeance? It's impossible to imagine. Can you imagine in 1995, in November of 1995, George H.W. Bush going around the country refusing to accept Bill Clinton and saying he's going to run in 96 to reclaim the White House? It's so outside of the norm of history. And we do need to cover the legal stuff, because who's even keeping track? You have a criminal case in Georgia. You have a criminal case at the federal level in Washington on January 6th. You have a criminal case in Florida on the federal level on alleged mishandling of classified documents. You have a civil case in New York on Trump Organization and a $250 million fine. And you have a criminal case in New York about the alleged hush money payments Trump made in 2016 to try to subvert campaign finance laws. I used the word subvert and allege there, John. But
there you go. Well, let me just pursue the platforming. So you do think that we have somewhat exaggerated the threat? That was my original question.
No.
Yes or no?
I think democracy is under grave threat, and I can't tell you, I can't even go up to people anymore. It has changed so much, John, in even 5 years. If I approach a person in public and say, Robert Costa, CBS News, the instant, and not because it's about me personally, I hope, but the instant aversion, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, no one wants to speak, no one wants to communicate. I mean, the tragedy of this country, the real tragedy, I think, of American democracy is so many people I meet and actually get them to be candid with me. They often tell me they're not even being candid with their own partners or spouses about their own positions and their own politics. So even in the home, people are isolated. And democracy and the problems facing it are exacerbating in this isolated culture and society we now have where everyone lives on Instagram and their phones. No one talks to their neighbor or even their family member. So how can we expect to have any kind of civic fabric if we can't even have it in the family that lives next door?
But isn't this also about, go back to language?
Yeah.
That I haven't commented on the whole language discussion, but
You're safe.
And I think
You're
I
smarter than me.
have some, again, contrarian views on this. I don't think we've exaggerated the threat to democracy, but I think when the media hits DEFCON 5 on every single thing, it contributes to the news fatigue that we're already seeing. And I think that in order to communicate with people and to trust is the coin of the realm in what we do. That's our currency. And if that means that in order to go to where people are, I need to neutralize my language or rephrase something in order to communicate something, then I'm fine doing that. I would rather have someone engage with someone and have a dialogue and be able to reach someone if that means tailoring what I'm saying a bit to them, because I think the facts at the end of the day are more important than the media or the way that we're communicating that message. And I think that's where things get so lost. I mean, all of these different outlets and these different ways of engaging that exist now, they facilitate a certain type of language. Cable news, you have to say what you mean in 2 minutes. Twitter, you have to say what you mean in however, or X, whatever, the site formerly known as Twitter, as we have to write in print copy. You only have a certain amount of letters or words, and so it cuts down, it infringes on the ability for nuance, and I think it has led to also, in addition to news fatigue, it's led to people being scared to engage in dialogue because of fear of being accused of anti-Semitism, of being accused of being racist. There are all these words and these labels that have been so easily thrown around, and that is why I think we all have exhibited a lot of caution when it comes to using such, what's the word? Very forceful, strong language.
Jackie, just one quick follow-up, and then I'm going to go to Heidi. How large do you think is the universe of people who are persuadable depending on the language that you use? I ask that because my suspicion is it's quite small, that there is no language that you could use, for example, as a member of the mainstream press, talking to a segment, which is not insignificant within the Republican Party, that subscribes to, say, the QAnon theory. I don't think whatever language you use would make a difference, but do you think there is a large segment of the audience where it does make a difference?
Well, that is a question that the management and business folks at Washington Post have been studying for a while. And it's why we have, I think, come out with a lot of new different products. It's also why I think, if you've probably noticed, that we've been pairing a lot of our hard news with softer news. So, eat your greens and get your sweets too. How many of you subscribe here to the New York Times because they also have Wordle and Spelling Bee? I mean, those things are effective to drawing readers in. And us high-minded coastal elites, or, at least that is a lot of the view of some of the people that we're unable to reach, might laugh at that, but I think that we all should be taking seriously different ways to reach different audiences, and it might be small, but I think connecting with them in the first place is a good start. I mean, I think developing relationships with them, however you can. I used to write a newsletter, and I found that actually we drew in a lot of different types of people, because at the top of our newsletter we had sort of like a colloquial, casual way of engaging with people, whether it was an inside joke or a personal tidbit or something about my dog. At the end of the day, everyone is just a person and they want to connect with you. And so if you can find a way to connect, then you overcome at least that first barrier to being able to at least have a further dialogue with them.
Personally, as somebody who spent 10 years writing politics for the New York Times, I value the New York Times cooking app almost as much as the political coverage. But Heidi, let me let you close with a question before I go to audience questions, and that is, how do you grade how well journalism is rising to meet this moment?
Look, I don't think that we lack for Cronkites and Brokaws in our generation. I think it's the terrain that we're working on is extremely perilous, and a lot of it, to Jackie's point about language and that kind of like some of the hyperbolic language that we're seeing, well, where does that come from? It's not in generally the storied newspapers or evening newscasts. It's on the 24-hour linear television cable news circuit, where it's 24 hours and you need guests and you need content, and the most explosive thing is what gets the headline and what gets mocked up and put out on digital. So I think that there has to be a sweet spot between being very careful about how we engage with those who we cover and those who we want to inform in order to get information, because that's our first job, is to get the information. But then the second part of that is accurately portraying the information. And I think, again, that we are failing to meet the moment if we don't contextualize for the public what that information is and what it means in a broader context of history, and what's happening in terms of the platforms of the two parties, and what's happening all throughout the world in terms of democracy. So to get back to your question, I'm going to go to the poll there, where the numbers are not good for us in terms of whether they think we're biased or whether we're leading to participating in polarization. Again, this is a really difficult knot that's been tied, and it's going to take quite some time to unravel it. It has to do with also for-profit journalism in this country, that they have to make money for us to be journalists. And they haven't figured out yet in a digital age how to do that. 360 newspapers in the country have gone out of business just since 2019. There are a lot of people who want to be journalists. They want to be the local face that you trust, because the polling tells us that while people may not trust the media broadly, they trust their local news reporters. The problem is that's all going away. Now, in the vein of being an optimist, what we're seeing are some exciting things, like nonprofit newsrooms trying to get their breath and trying to get out of the gate here, which could be a very good development, because if you look at the rankings by Reporters Without Borders, I think it is, on freedom of the press globally, the countries that do the best, by the way, Canada's like 15 and we're like 45. So what's the difference there? Like, what's going on in Canada that we don't have here? There are some hallmarks, including disclosure of who each media outlet is owned by, public disclosure that's required, a strong central nonprofit broadcasting platform in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Politicians, we didn't get to that yet, and I want to say one more thing on that, but politicians who don't call us fake news. And I'll just end on this study, because I think this says a lot about how we got here as well, which is Cambridge University in 1999 said, hey, what's going on with this increasing tendency for the public to view the media as liberal? What's happening here? And they commissioned a 20-year study, which studied both rhetoric by politicians and content and being put out by those news organizations. And what they found was that while the content hadn't changed so much, the rhetoric had become extremely negative towards the media. Look, even Jefferson, who was the strongest advocate for the media, apparently once he got into office, decided he didn't like newspapers, some newspapers in particular as well. So this is not new that politicians, Bill Clinton had and Hillary Clinton, a famously tense relationship with the media. So this is not just a Republican Republicans viewing us as liberal phenomenon. And this has been happening, but it kind of went on steroids during the 1990s with the dawn of, again, linear television. Newt Gingrich in the House made this a big part of the plank of the Republican Party, and George Bush's campaign slogan was, "Annoy the media, elect George Bush," right? That was kind of like playful. I covered his son, George W. Bush, and he used to playfully call us the filter. But what happened between then and now was just a real explosion, again, which I'll end on my interaction with Lynn Sweet in 2016, warning me that, we're not in Kansas anymore.
All right, guys, we're almost out of time, but we got some audience questions. I'm going to pose them to just one of you and ask for a quick answer to see if we can get as many through as many as possible. Bob, Mary asks the question, are young people pursuing careers in journalism, is it still viewed as an enviable, patriotic, and civic-minded career?
It is. There should be more opportunities. Unfortunately, sometimes news organizations are shrinking, not hiring as much, but I am heartened to see so many college students and others are looking to join the journalistic ranks and to participate.
Jackie, Adrian has a question. Is the American electorate curious enough to seek out accurate information, or is there already enough content for people, but they read only what they want to hear?
I think confirmation bias is a big issue, but I also want to get back to this idea of news literacy. I don't think it's a matter of curiosity necessarily. I think that seeking out accurate information is something that everyone could use a 101 course in. It's something that should be taught in schools, how to verify what you're being taught, what you're learning, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, how to use Google, how to use these databases that we use on a regular basis, LexisNexis, JSTOR, things that I had access to growing up in school at a really great public school, but I know that a lot of people around the country now don't have access to. I don't think we can necessarily put this on an individual's curiosity. I think it needs to be fostered and nurtured and cultivated.
Jennifer asks, Heidi, a recent opinion survey of 25 countries shows the least trusted groups are government leaders and journalists. How do you change that to gain more trust?
How do I change it?
You personally.
Look, I think we need to be very transparent about how we come to our facts. Like Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, you are welcome to your own opinion, but you are not welcome to your own facts. The problem is in this country that we can't agree on basic facts anymore. Basic facts are challenged, so we can't get to that second stage of having a discussion about what is the right path forward. So me personally, I want to be more accessible to anybody who's reading my material. I want them to know how I come about the information that I have. I want them to know that before I publish an investigative piece, I've given the subject of my piece a week, 2 weeks. I've had several conversations, or I've been completely shut out by that person who doesn't want to talk about it. And I want them to know that it's gone through a process of being picked apart by a team of standards editors as the first row of death by a million cuts. And then the second one by our legal team. Because when I'm being viewed under the same media tent as a Twitter account named Cat Turd that has 4 times the viewers or the followers that I do.
Your feed is much better than Cat Turds.
Thank you, John. I think we need to be very transparent, and that's my personal commitment.
All right, we've got 3 more. I'll take the last one. Bob, Carl asks, do you believe modern journalists are doing an adequate job right now of holding current politicians accountable for their words and deeds?
I think everyone's trying to get the most obtainable version of the truth, to get as close to that as possible. I think there is exhaustion in our business. People are leaving more than coming in, it seems, at times, due to the way the landscape is evolving at such a rapid pace and often in an uncomfortable way for many people. I think the challenge for so many journalists in holding people to account is that politicians now do so much to avoid even having a conversation with journalists, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. We need to have more engagement with politicians to answer questions. Too many politicians won't have news conferences. They won't engage with reporters in the hallways. Candidates won't. They want to go to reporters they like, or they want to go to partisan outlets, or they don't want to do anything except issue a press release. And that give and take is really eroding by the day on Capitol Hill, on the campaign trail. And it's a shame because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter for us, but it matters for you because you're not getting the full spectrum of what people should be answering.
Jackie, Margaret wants to know, how do you define democracy?
Oh. That's,
You are on the spot.
I know. Small d or big D?
Small d.
Just the people's power.
Well said.
And the last one from Anne is for me, and it's how do you distinguish between lies told to the American public by current and past presidents? Look, I think lying is inherent to the quest for votes in office by politicians. And I think all politicians to one degree or another engage in it. And that's always been true. It's a question of degree. And I do think that because of the particular circumstances of the moment and the political movement that he leads, Donald Trump is in a different category than any person that we've seen before in our government. You know, the question arose before about, is the press, how do we keep the public from believing the press is liberal? I don't think that's possible because the press is liberal compared to the median voter in the country, and that goes with the territory of the kind of people who go into journalism and why they go into journalism. That places them in a little bit different category. But I think that that being the case, we have to do the best that we can to test whoever's running for office and then fairly represent how it is that they're doing. And I think that if you've been watching this stuff long enough, as I mentioned earlier, you can, with increasing confidence, see patterns and an understanding of how pieces fit together. And I think that in this particular moment, it is incumbent on the journalism business, at least the part of it that values what's true and what isn't, to make plain who's telling the truth and who isn't. And that's an imperfect process. Each of us approaches it differently, but I think the best you can hope for is to have well-intentioned people exercising their judgment and conveying to the best of their ability what's accurate to the American people. And with that, we thank our fantastic panel here.